Hello, and welcome to Real Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager. I'm pleased to have with me back on the show again, Bryan Null. Welcome to the show, Bryan.
Thanks for having me. It's always a great time to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. Of course, Bryan, a long time good friend of ours here on Real Film Snobs and a good friend of mine personally and my husband's. And so one of the things we have in common is that Bryan likes to get together with me and my husband and listen to music. Bryan, I think we could safely say you are a music lover, a lover of all types of music as well.
Very
And
much. Yeah.
yeah, and we put this idea together of doing an episode on the best musical biopics of all time. We kind of debated whether we wanted to do ones we hadn't seen yet, in which case it could be kind of rough going. I think we could still do that down the road. There's nothing to say. I've been taping this show for 20 years, and unless something happens and I get hit by a bus, maybe I'll be doing it for another 20 years. So we could always revisit this topic, but I thought at least start with our favorites so we could start with ones that are actually good. My
Yes.
little op-ed piece I'm going to start here with for our audience is that, in my opinion, musical biopics is probably one of the worst genres of movies in that um, it tends to be the one more often than not where the movies are not very good. And it's interesting that they keep getting made despite that. Documentaries about musicians and bands, I think, tend to be better. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But the biggest one being is that when you're watching a documentary about a musician, you're actually seeing the real musician and hearing their actual music. I think also, and this is just my opinion, of course, I'd be curious to see what you think, Bryan, but I think there's two reasons why musical biopics are such a rough genre. One is that film is inherently a visual medium, of course, and it's hard to convey music visually or that make music interesting visually. So that's one reason. I think the second reason is that a lot of filmmakers or the people that make movies, the producers, are often not actually music fans or don't know much about music. What they're interested in often is the sexy stuff, the drugs, the alcohol use, the sex relationships, whatever. They're not as interested in the music as they are about the crazy things that happen in someone's life. And then the music kind of always takes a back seat then to the story. Those are my reasons why I think musical biopics tend to be bad.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think they continue to be made over and over, even mediocre ones, because they're wildly popular. It seems like everyone wants to see these music biographies. Um, but but the problem is they're wildly mediocre. Most of the music biographies I see are not necessarily horrible pictures. They have great production values. They have great soundtracks, typically, or great if you like the artists that they're about. But they're just super bland. They all hit on
Yeah.
these similar notes that you talked about: wild and crazy lifestyle, um, hardships, drug use, this sort of thing. We'll see some of that in the ones we're going to look at today. But I think that what sets the good ones apart is they take a different view of these characters, and they care about the music, they care about the musicians,
Yeah.
um, they care about the topics. Um, I find this trouble with almost any movie about any type of artist. They have difficulty in film showing what the artistic process is like.
Yeah.
And
True.
so the default then is to show the trouble the person had because they could show that, but they're
Right.
unable to really show you what it's like to be an artist. And that's where they
It's
kind of
true.
fail
It's
for me.
true for all artists. I feel like visual artists, there's a few, they have the same problems, but there have been a little bit better movies about them because it is visual. I think of a movie like Mr. Turner, which I thought was really well done, for
Yep.
instance, the Mike Lee movie, because it actually showed his process, why he chose, and because Turner literally painted what was outside his window, we could immediately draw from that a little bit. But I think you're right. Any type of artist, it's true that it often gets watered down. So the ones we're going to talk about today, even though, as you said, quite a few of them do still have some of those, the drugs, alcohol, sex types of issues. The music comes front and center. And one of the things Julian wanted me to make sure to point out to people is that one of his biggest pet peeves that's become popular in recent years wasn't the case in early or earlier biopics, is that there seems to be this insistence in real and recent films. And I feel like it started with Ray and Walk the Line of the actors singing or performing the music themselves. And that is weirdly become a very popular thing to do. They even did it in the new Amy Winehouse biopic. And it's awful because it's like, why do you like the artist if you want to hear someone else singing their
Absolutely.
music, for instance, you know? And some of the better ones, What's Love Got to Do with It? They didn't even try. They didn't have Angela Bastian do like, you know, they just put Tina Turner's voice on. It's like this whole weird thing with having the people. I mean, Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor, but he doesn't sound like Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash is the
Right.
only one who sounds like Johnny Cash. And
Yeah, we didn't
so,
come to see the Joaquin Phoenix story, which probably would be a pretty cool movie,
right,
but
it
we came to
would.
see a movie about and hear Johnny Cash.
Yeah, and we didn't get to hear Johnny Cash in that movie, which was, I thought, one of the flaws with it. And Ray, which is one of the most popular biopics financially, it did very well. Has some of the is almost sort of the pattern, the blueprint for how you make one of those types of movies. So, with all
Yeah.
that, let's get into the good stuff. So,
All right.
because we've talked about what we don't like in musical biopics, let's talk about what works for us at least. And of course, this is our opinion, and not everyone's going to agree. I'm going to start off with mine because I like experimental movies, and Todd Haynes is one of my all-time favorite directors. I think, in my opinion, he's one of the better, greatest living American directors. I'm Not There from 2007. This movie made my top 10 the year it came out. It's a biopic of Bob Dylan that actually doesn't mention the name Bob Dylan, and he's played by, I don't know, 5 or 6 different actors throughout the movie. The reason I feel like this is such a great biopic, Todd Haynes has actually tried to 3 times make musical biopics, 2 of which he got in legal issues with. This is one of the ones he actually got out. Karen Carpenter's story, which is one of his earlier films, to this day is unviewable in many places, though you can see it on YouTube, hint, hint. And because both Mattel Corporation and the Carpenter family sued to keep it off the screens. And so that one's very experimental. He uses Barbie dolls to portray Karen Carpenter. Then he went on to make Velvet Goldmine, which was originally supposed to be a biopic about David Bowie. David Bowie wouldn't give the rights to his music, so he ended up making it more of an amalgamation of a movie about glam rock in general. Here, he takes the figure of Bob Dylan, who in some ways is one of the most nebulous artists of our time in terms of being able to figure out who is Bob Dylan. And he plays with that very idea by having all these different actors play him at various stages in his career to really show us that Bob Dylan is not knowable. And that's part of the allure of Bob Dylan. That's part of who he actually is. And of course, this movie is famous for Cate Blanchett playing one of the versions of Bob Dylan, and in my opinion, playing the best version of Bob Dylan. She does such a great performance that when we walked out of the theater, my husband said, "Who was the guy who played Bob Dylan in that one sequence?" And he was asking me about it, and I'm like, "That's not a guy, Julian. That's Cate Blanchett." And he's like, "No, that looked just like Bob Dylan." I'm like, "No, that was Cate Blanchett." So all the performance are really good. And what he really gets at here is the idea of the unknowability of Bob Dylan. And I love that about it. And it's got fantastic performances by all the actors, including Christian Bale and Heath Ledger and many others. And I love that Todd Haynes is a more experimental director. I think he's a real artist, which is why I think this movie is better than the usual biopic because he doesn't just play it straight. It's not a Bob Dylan was born this date and this happened and this had this horrible, usually it's something about horrible parents, right? It's always some horrible parent thing that causes them to become an artist. And, so we've seen that movie. He's like, I'm going to dispense with any of that garbage and I'm just going to make something artistic and interesting. So what do you think about this movie?
Yeah, I agree. But what I love about this movie is um, it goes somewhere biopics had never gone before, at least as far as I know. And it was to take these personas or these known personas of Bob Dylan and try to examine them to give us some view of this mysterious character. Um, I liked this movie a lot when it came out. I liked it more this time. I was really happy to revisit it. Um, of course, I come at this as a huge Bob Dylan fan, and
Right.
so it that adds another layer. Someone who has listened to Dylan my entire life, who loves his work and who loves his persona. So it was fun to watch for those reasons. I do find if I can um, offer a couple of things that bother me about the film, not and
Sure.
only bother me. Um, these are the sorts of things that bother me about good films. So it's not a complaint to knock it down anything. But there are, I think, five versions of Bob Dylan, um, prophet,
Five, yeah.
outlaw,
Hmm.
yeah, but none of them are musicians. And I always find that very interesting that the movie is focused so much on who he is in our culture, who he is to himself in our pop culture, that none of those figures are musicians. There's a poet, which is probably the closest, and then maybe a prophet, that sort of thing, and then a star. Um, but none of them are actually the musician. And I'm curious about that because in the end, the movie it focuses on an earlier portion of his life, the very early days up maybe into the 70s.
Hmm.
Um, and I think Haynes does this on purpose. Part of the answer to who Bob Dylan is that question. He's a musician, and it's in the soundtrack because he uses later Dylan in the soundtrack. He uses Man in the Long Black Coat and High Water, which are two of my favorite later Dylan songs. And they're in the soundtrack, even though that period of time is never covered in the film. And so um, Dylan answers the question a little bit himself, which is, I just kept playing. Like, who is this man? He's a mystery. He's somebody who kept playing music and
Yeah.
continues to play music. So I appreciate that. But it is interesting to me that the musician piece is never there
Yeah.
in
Interesting.
the film. Uh, but
I think that's a valid critique, and I definitely know there are people that are very critical of this movie. So and it is called Real Film Snob, so feel free
yes,
to critique away.
but that said, it's the sort of critique you make about a movie you really like. So I really like
Yeah.
this film. And I'll tell you what hit me this time, and this was a surprise because I kind of didn't pay attention the first time very much, is the Richard Gere section.
Mm.
He plays Dylan as the outlaw,
Yeah.
like Billy the Kid, sort of
Right.
outlaw. That section was really touching to me actually this time, and part of it is the way it ends, and I won't give away too much, but um, it ends with him giving up the thing he had been searching for. The story is about him searching uh, for something, and then he rides away on a train and sees what it was he was searching and essentially has to say goodbye and move
Yeah.
on down the road. And that really touched me this time. It was that sense of uh, loss, but also giving up something you love for something you know you need to do. And to me, that's part of the Dylan mystique. He gave up fame in some ways, step
Mm.
away from the spotlight to keep doing um, what he felt he wanted to do, what he needed to do. So
Yeah.
that part touched me this time, and I was shocked because the first time Kate Blanchett is so good. You're just so focused on that. These other
Right. It's almost like
stars,
Richard Gere's section becomes a letdown. You're like, Richard Gere, he's no Kate
yeah.
Blanchett, but
But that
it is
section
a
was
yeah.
so cool, yeah.
Yeah, it is it's a great film. I recommend it. Definitely not a conventional biopic. So if you're
Yep,
wanting to watch something to just learn about Bob Dylan, probably I know they're making a new biopic with Timothy Chalamet playing Dylan, and that one will
of
probably
course,
be, I'm guessing, a very conventional biopic
yeah.
and would answer anything like. But I always feel like if you just want to read all the finer points of someone's life, just read a book about that.
And
Why would
he's
you
written his
watch a
own book
movie?
about himself,
Right, exactly. So what do you need
so
a
go read
movie to
that.
do
Yeah,
that for? So anyway, that's my opinion. But let's go to your favorite, I believe,
yeah.
biopic of all time. Yeah.
Can I add one? I just want to add one name,
Oh, sure,
Charlotte
sure.
Gainsborough, who plays. She's in the Jude section, which is the Heath Ledger section. She plays the wife, and she is luminous in this film, and to me, kind of
Hmm.
the heart of that section of the movie. And she's not in enough movies that get much widespread attention. So I just wanted to note that because she's awesome. I think.
Yeah, she's a great actress. I've seen her in a lot, but of course I watch foreign films, and she's in a lot of
Yes,
those, or Lars von
yes,
Trier films. Anyway, so yeah, let's get to your
yes.
favorite one.
Sorry, yes, I wanted to mention that. So my favorite biopic of all time is a film called Lowdown from 2014, directed by Jeff Preiss, and it's based on an autobiographical book by Joe Albany's daughter. Joe Albany is the subject of the film. A great jazz musician. This film is set in the 70s, but his career lasted a long time. He played with the likes of Charlie Parker and some of the jazz greats. But he was a great musician who was not incredibly well known. And seen through the eyes of his daughter, who's played by Elle Fanning, um, we get to see a glimpse of someone who struggled in life. They struggled as a parent, and they struggled day to day to make a living as a great musician. And also playing, I should say, Joe Albany was played by the great John Hawkes, who's one of the best
Yes.
actors out there. Um, Another character in this film is North Hollywood. And this, to me, is one of the best films I've ever seen about a place and time. And it is so rare to get a film that gives you such deep texture of a place, especially without effects. It's a conventionally made film. Um, those effects tend to soften all the edges, and this movie has every hard edge you can think of. It's a film
Hmm.
I would love to inhabit, even though this is a rough part of Los Angeles area of Hollywood. I would inhabit so many of the sets of this place with deep comfort. And yeah, I could live in Lowdown, I guess,
Yeah.
minus
Well,
the heroin
my,
use.
yeah, it was like minus the horrible drug addiction, hopefully. Well, you love the 70s. I mean, you're
Yep.
partial to the 70s and you love jazz. And so it's
Yes.
set in the 70s jazz scene of Hollywood. What I think is, well, uh, so you mentioned John Hawkes. I just have to give Elle Fanning is also fantastic as his daughter.
Yes.
She's a great actress. But John Hawkes, a previous episode that I did with Paul Turner, we talked about Julianne Nicholson, a character actress who I just think doesn't get enough lead roles, and she's just fantastic. And John Hawkes is like the male version of her, and that he tends to play supporting roles more. People might remember him as the really creepy guy from Winter's Bone, or he was in
Yep.
Me and You and Everyone We Know, playing exactly the opposite character of that one. And here he gets a lead performance, of course, in a movie that hardly anyone saw, but still, like, he is the lead. And it's so awesome when you get to see a great actor, a great character actor get to chew on a full lead performance. And so that's one of the things I loved about this movie. It does, in some ways, have some of the tropes we talked about because it's true to Joe Albany's life. He was a drug addict, right? So you can't leave that out. But one thing I was thinking about, Bryan, is one of the critiques I think I have, one of the raw problems with musical biopics is that they tend to make them about the most famous musicians, right? Because they want to
Right.
bring in people that are like, oh, I want the soundtrack because it's going to have, they've been trying to get a Janis Joplin biopic made for years. And I think it's a mistake because no one's going to sound like her and they're probably not going to use her real voice. But we know a lot about Janis Joplin. There's been documentaries made about her. I mean, a lot of the most famous musicians are the ones we know about their lives. People, they should make more movies about the Joe Albanese of the world, the people
Yes.
that we don't know about, so that we can discover them. Because I wasn't that familiar with his music. You and Julian are because you're jazz people, but like a lot of people aren't going to know about these folks unless they make a movie about them. One of the ones I thought about putting on this list but didn't was Blaze, which is a movie Ethan Hawke directed about a real life musician that I think is a great biopic, in part because I thought, oh, this is a great way for people to discover this person's music.
Yeah. I love that movie too because it's a brand new musician, to us, or at least to me, in
Yeah,
terms of,
yeah. No, I didn't
yeah,
know his
that
music at
was
all before I'd
fabulous.
seen the movie, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the performances, and he's a struggling musician. He's not popular. He's playing out of his car. We need to see more of that. The stars tend to take over. Everyone wants to play the Ray Charles type characters, but
Yeah.
it's the Joe Albanese of the world and the Blazes that need the attention to their music, right?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Elle Fanning too, because she is wondrous to me in this film as playing somebody she's innocent, but she's not naive. She
Hmm.
sees everything that's going on. She has full understanding of it, but she still tries to be a child in this film, a child who loves her father. And it's her character, or she plays the character who wrote the eventual book this is based on, which I would recommend. It's also called Lowdown. It's a great book. But the subtitle of it is Jazz, Junk, and Other Childhood Fairy Tales.
Mm.
And that fairy tale piece kind of fits this movie. It's this odd reality that feels like a version of a fairy tale. I mean, there's a character who lives in the walls of the hotel, in this
Hmm.
labyrinth of the walls of the hotel. And she roams the streets of North Hollywood on her own as a 13 and 15-year-old, which is the setting of this film. And so it has an odd fairy tale texture, but hard based reality. And I love that conflict in this film. It's
Yeah.
quite beautiful, I think.
It is, and it's really it's on streaming. People should watch it. It's easily available on Canopy and other streaming
Yep.
services. And just to give it some more play for those people out there who care about such things, in addition to all the great actors we mentioned, it's also got Peter Dinklage and Lena Headey or Headey and
Yep.
Glenn Close, Flea.
Yeah,
So Caleb Landry Jones, who is in more recent years getting quite a bit of attention. So it's got a great cast, but I really feel like John Hawkes and Elle Fanning are obviously the reasons to see it. So we should move on to
absolutely.
your next one while we're
Yes.
before we run
Yes.
out of time. Yeah.
This one has a little bit different take on this is a full breadth take of a musician's life, and it's 2007's La Vie en Rose by Olivier Dahan, and it of course stars Marion Cotillard as Edith Piaf. It was my introduction to her. I may have seen her in some smaller films, but this was the film that brought her into the spotlight dramatically. Um, Not much is known about Edith Piaf, and I feel like this film tries to give us a sense for who she was, and that's something that a lot of these films don't do. That's what I like about this film, is it gives us a character that we may have heard of, but we don't know that much about,
Hmm.
and tries to give us a sense for their personality and what drove them. One thing I appreciate about this film very much, of course, I'm interested in things of faith, and more woven throughout this picture is her interest in Saint Teresa of Lisieux. She wasn't actually a saint when this movie starts, um, but the film actually starts with a prayer to Saint Teresa to save Edith's life, and
Hmm.
I think that those characters are connected. Edith Piaf was called the Little Sparrow. Um, Saint Teresa was the little child of God, and her theology was known as the Little Way. And they're both literally very small characters. They're tiny people who made a huge difference through uh, either faith in God or faith in themselves. Edith, at one point, is supposed to go on stage and can't. And she says, if I can't go out there, I'll lose faith in myself. And it gives us a sense for what drove someone to extremes in life and lifestyle, um, and then extremes in terms of their talent and musicianship. Um, and I think it was that drive is what makes this film so important to me. Plus, it's artistically rendered. I feel like it, though it uses flashbacks, it uses them oddly, almost the way perhaps a musician might, with dissonant notes in a song. So,
It's
um,
beautiful. It's a beautifully shot movie, and it is sort of, I think Marion Cotillard was already working in French films, but it was sort of my introduction to her as well. And of course, she's gone on to become a big star in a way, but interestingly, often not getting good lead roles like this one.
yeah,
We always see Marion Cotillard always getting to play the girlfriend role and the side character in movies, and I don't get it because she's got that rare combination of amazing beauty and talent, which you think would, somehow, I think because she's French, maybe she won the, Academy Award for this movie. So I think you would think that would propel you into some sort of other status, but for some reason, sometimes that doesn't always happen for women. I think you're right. Like nobody, I mean, I had heard of her music, but I didn't know anything about Edith Piaf, as a lot of Americans I'm sure don't. So you do get to know more about her because of the movie. And Marion Cotillard, apparently, it was one of these, performances where she literally changed her body. She changed her hairline. She's 5'6" in real life, and Edith Piaf was tiny, like 4'11" or something. So she literally
yes.
shrunk her body down to look smaller, and tried to especially as she wasted away at the end of her life. So I'm trying to remember about the singing. I believe this is one where Cotillard did some of her own singing, which is a little bit going against my rule that you shouldn't do that. But I think they also used recordings of Edith Piaf as well. Yeah, it's
They did,
interesting.
yes. Yeah, and they actually, where they didn't have recordings of Edith Piaf to use for certain settings, they hired other professional musicians and singers to sing as well. But they did use a lot of Piaf's own voice and music. That's something that actually has been commented about the three we've discussed so far is great use of the artist's music within the film.
Right.
And they use it not just diegetically in this film. It is they use her voice as part of the soundtrack. I think quite
Yeah.
beautifully. And yeah, the physicality of her performance is like unlike anything I've seen. I mean, it is really interesting to watch her
Yeah.
every move and know that each one is meaningful.
I almost think it's really a shame that she doesn't get good roles like this more often, Marianne Cotillard. She's always, because of she's so gorgeous, I think she gets kind of typecast into the girlfriend or wife or the love interest, and it's, just the arm candy. And it's really
Yeah,
a shame because she's actually an amazing actor who could do a lot more if given the chance. I think this movie shows it. So let's move on to the last film we have, which is my second pick for the best biopics, musical biopics of all time, which is Bird. by Clint Eastwood. It's probably the oldest one on our list, which is
It
kind of
is.
interesting. But and of course, the interesting thing about Bird, and I think you're a bigger Clint Eastwood fan than I am even. But one of the things that I think, when I talked earlier about why a lot of biopics don't work, and what I think makes this movie work is that Clint Eastwood is an actual music fan, and specifically a jazz fan. And this movie is about the jazz musician Charlie Parker, also known as Bird, and he's played by Forrest Whitaker in a phenomenal performance. And of course, that's saying, of course, Forrest Whitaker. Today, we all think, oh yeah, Forrest Whitaker, great performance. But this is earlier on in his career in '88, and so he wasn't as well known in this period for being the great actor we know him today. He's absolutely phenomenal in this movie. But Clint Eastwood, I think the fact that he's a fan of the music also plays into the fact that the movie's so good and really captures what made Charlie Parker such a great musician. One of the things that's important to note is that Clint Eastwood took a lot of pains to isolate Bird's original recordings. But then because they don't want us to hear music from, he then took it into the studio and then had real bebop musicians, record the other parts. And so to get as authentic a sound as possible, but then of course with a 1988 sound, because that's one of the things movies want to do a lot is they want to give you modern sound for the sound systems of today, right? So, and that to do that rather than just hire somebody to play Bird's parts in the movie is really important because you're literally hearing Charlie Parker's horn sounds in the movie. And it's a tragic story. It's yet another jazz musician falling prey to drug use, and we've seen that before. But Forrest Whitaker's performance to me is so beautiful that it transcends some of those stereotypes.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And it's so important to hear Charlie Parker's horn and or saxophone in this because he was inventing and coming up with a new way of playing this instrument.
Hmm.
And to hear someone else do that, I think would have been unfortunate. Um, it's so good to actually hear Parker playing. And another thing, and you hit on it very, very nicely. Even though this hits on some of that blueprint for what a music biopic is, it is made with passion for its subject, for Charlie
Yes.
Parker specifically, and passion for jazz. And I think that sets it apart. And
Hmm.
also, this is another thing that I wish I would have brought it up in the opening. So many of these films look for the magic bullet of what caused their pain or their suffering.
Oh,
And
yeah. Like I
sometimes
said, trauma,
people,
usually the parents,
yes,
something like that, right? Yeah.
but this movie doesn't try to search for that. It's not about that. I mean, it gives you some things that may have caused him to turn to drugs, but it is not just saying this is what this person is about. They're not just about their trauma. This was an artist. And he does give you the great scene where Forrest Whitaker is trying to describe how he came up with the sound
Hmm.
or as Bird. And it's one of my favorite art scenes in a movie because it is someone describing what it felt like to come to this new sound and why it
Yeah,
was important. So yeah, I
exactly.
love
Yeah.
this movie.
Yeah, it's a great one. And yeah, so we've got a couple of jazz, Edith Piaf, of course, not jazz, but so we have some different kinds of music. We've explored
Yeah.
your Bob Dylan pop, so that's cool. We need to bring in like a heavy metal movie next time. But I'd love to have you on to talk about maybe next time we do ones none of it we haven't seen at all, and
Yeah.
then we experience them for the first time together and see if they play into some of the worst tropes or not. That would be fun to do if you're willing to come back on and do that sometime.
I'm always happy to come on. I'm so grateful you had me. So yeah, I would come back anytime.
It's so great to see you, Brian. Thank you. Stay cool. We're going through a heat wave here in Oregon, folks. But as always, have a great day and great movies. Thank you.